I want to talk today about layering, or to be more specific, I want to talk about how layering can be used to build up all sorts of different textures with coloured pencils. I think layering is often thought as just a way that you blend colours together, but there is more to it than that. Now, to start with, let's talk about what layering is and how you do it. So layering is exactly what it sounds like. It's where you build coloured pencils up in a series of light layers rather than just pressing really hard with the pencil. You'll see that for every drawing I create, all of them are built up using layers and gradually building one pencil on top of another. Now, I think the easiest way to explain how we can layer and build texture will be by drawing something. And I have found such an interesting drawing that has a huge amount of texture, this egg on toast. Now, this isn't something that you would think has a lot of texture, but the white of the egg has loads of little dips and holes in it, and the same with the toast. The toast has a lot of bubbles in it, as bread does, and we need to draw all of this texture. Now, you may think we need to start off by marking in all of this texture, just initially dive into all of the dots, but actually I want to start this in exactly the same way as I would for any drawing, whether it has loads of texture or not. I want to start off by building up the base layers, all of the underlying colors. Now, before we get started, if you do want to go through this drawing with me in a lot more detail, I do have a full tutorial available. In fact, I have loads of tutorials in a huge range of different subjects in colored pencil, graphite pencil, and watercolor pencil. For every single tutorial, I include really in-depth instructions, all of the real-time footage, details of all of the colors I'll be using, the sketch outlines, and the reference photo. And I have some reasonably complicated drawings, not only like this egg, but like this, for example. And I have some much faster, simpler, more beginner-friendly drawings as well. So if you want to learn how to draw really stunning drawings like this, do check out the link in the description. So as I mentioned, I want to begin by building up the base layers. And what I mean by this is building up a light layer of color, the lightest color that I can see in each section of the drawing. So I'm starting off here by looking for the lightest color I can see within the toast. And actually, that's a little bit of a surprising color. I think the closest color in my set is actually a French gray. Gray is not a color that you would expect on toast, but when I look at those lightest areas, that's what I can see. So what I want to do is build up, as I say, a light layer of this color over all of the toast. And note that I am not worrying about building up any texture at this point. I literally just want to block in a smooth layer of this color. Now, to help me do this, first up, you'll notice that I am holding the pencil quite far down, not right close to the tip. By holding the pencil a little bit further back, it literally stops me from being able to press too hard. And it allows me to really easily build up that lovely and light layer. The next thing I'm doing is working in kind of circular or oval motions. You'll see that I've drawn in around the edge, and now I'm just lightly building up these kind of oval sections to try and get this pencil down as smoothly as possible. And the final thing that I'm doing is making sure that I'm always working with a sharp pencil. I can't stress how important this is. The difference between building up base layers with a blunt pencil versus a sharp pencil is way bigger than you would imagine, and I do frequently sharpen my pencil so that it goes down as smoothly as possible. So it's very, very light, but that is the goal here. We're working generally from the lighter colors towards the darker colors. And once I've blocked in the lightest color on the toast, I then want to move on to the lightest color I can see on the egg. And if I ignore any very bright white patches that we can add in a bit later, the lightest color that I can see on the egg is again a gray, but a different kind of gray. I think this time it's more of a cold gray. So let's block in this color all over the egg white, still pressing lightly. You'll notice here I'm using something called a pencil extender. This is a very short stubby pencil that I'm using here, and it's not going to be possible for me to hold it far back because it's too small, or really have any kind of control over the pencil when it's this small. So by putting a pencil extender on, it just means I get a bit more life out of my pencil and I can use it much easier. I do highly recommend if you don't have one. And then for the yolk I again want to be looking for the lightest color I can see in this section. This is a very different color now. Obviously, we're filling in a kind of orangey yellow, but I still want to be going through the same process, pressing really nice and lightly, working with a sharp pencil and working in circular motions. And then I've got something down in each area of the drawing. It's obviously not looking hugely like an egg yet. It's not looking very realistic. And we haven't got any texture, but let's keep building up these base layers to begin with, and then we'll add the texture in a second. So now, because I want to be working from those lighter colors towards the darker colors, I now want to be filling in a brown pencil. So when I look at the toast, it's not all one solid block of color. If you look beyond the texture, the dotty texture, it has some areas that are darker than others. Generally speaking, around the crust, it is much darker than on the rest of the bread. So I just want to be going around using this reasonably light brown to just begin marking in where I need this to be a bit darker. I think of me building up the base layers as kind of getting my bearings, working out what needs to go where, so that when we move on to building up all of the texture, it's much easier. And then I can move on to a darker French grey, still a French grey because I think that is the main colour on the toast, but the crust is more of a brown colour, the middle bit of the toast is more of a grey, I would say. And again, I want to be looking beyond the texture and looking at the general lights and darks. I often find it helps to squint when looking at the toast, for example, because it helps you look past all of the texture and detail to see those underlying colours. You can see here though that I'm still holding the pencil far back. I've once again got a pencil extender on this pencil. I'm holding the pencil far back so that I can build up the colour really nice and lightly, and I'm still working in those little circular motions. So let's do the same on the egg white, moving on to a darker cool grey. I'm not worrying about building up all of the little dots, but I do want to build up the overall darker, larger, darker sections and just generally build in, as I say, those underlying shapes. And as I gradually work from those lighter colours towards the darker colours, although it's still not looking realistic, it is certainly looking more like an egg on toast, although a bit cartoony. So once I've built up all of these underlying colours and I've got something quite clearly marked down in each section, it's at this point that I can start thinking about building in some texture. And I would say that this is a simpler process than you might expect. So what I'm doing is working through one area at a time, not worrying about the general colours. I just want to get the shapes mapped in. So you'll see that I'm going through again with the same colour that I used for the base layers. This is a darker French grey, and I'm just mapping in the most prominent holes within the toast, marking the outline and then shading in, trying to get them mapped in a reasonably accurate place to the reference photo. Now, some of these dots are definitely on the reference photo darker than others, but I'm not worrying about that at this point. I literally just want to, again, still get my bearings. I want to work out what's going to go where. Now, this is quite a long process because I am taking my time to try and get it as accurate as possible. Although I do want to get it accurate, I'm not trying to make it exactly perfectly the same because I think that would just take a really, really long time. But once I've got the bigger dots marked in, adding in these smaller dots, it's kind of a bit easier to work out where they need to go. And as I say, they don't need to be perfect. Now, once again, I want to be working with a sharp pencil here. I'm adding in a lot of little details, and I do want to have really good control over where the pencil's going, which isn't going to be possible with a blunt pencil. And you'll see that I'm still not pressing hard. We're still going to be building a lot more pencil on top of this texture. So I don't want to be pressing hard and then I won't be able to add more pencil over the top. So once I've filled in that top left corner, I can move on to the top right. This toast is quite nice because you can work quite kind of methodically, just working one corner at a time and filling in all of the dots and holes that I can see from that reference. Now, I do think that it looks a bit weird at this point, but that's okay. I just think it's a case of trusting the process and it will come together in the end. So once I've gone through and marked in the grey areas on all of the corners of the toast, marked marked in these grey dots, I can then use a brown to mark in some of the dots that I can see closer to the edge around the crust. But it is exactly the same process. And then let's do the same thing again on the egg white. So the egg white has a lot of dips and holes in it that are creating an awful lot of shadows. In fact, I think it's important to notice that the egg white is not white. It's actually in many places a very dark grey. So it's worth bearing in mind that we will need to build up a lot of colour here. So I'm just lightly mapping in all of these dots and holes, just anywhere that will need to be a bit darker with a darker cold grey. This is the same cold grey that I used before. Now I think it is worth mentioning at this point that although on the most part I'm not worrying about any colours, if an area is particularly dark, I'm not building up a darker colour on that area at the moment. If I were to want an area to be darker with this pencil, I wouldn't press harder, I would go over it more times. So on this shadow here that I'm filling in, I want this to be made a little bit darker. It's looking too light now in comparison to all of the holes I've added in. So you can see I'm just going over it more times, building up more of the pencil. I'm not pressing hard. And then once I've gone over all of the dots on the egg, I'm just going to go over some of them again with a brown pencil because I think they do have more of a brown tone to some of them. And then reasonably quickly, we've got our bearings on what needs to go where. I now find it easiest to focus on one section at a time. So I'm starting off by focusing on the egg white. And actually, as I say, so many areas of this egg need to be so much darker than what they are at the moment. So I'm using an even darker cold grey to build up all of those shadows even more. And it feels so weird building up such dark colours on something we call an egg white, but I can see them, so we should draw them. That is always the rule, even if it seems weird. So I find it easiest at this point of a drawing to really start focusing on one section at a time. So we can focus on the egg and the egg white, and then in a short while we can start focusing on the toast. And you can see I can work around in a circle, so just working around the egg, building up more of this colour. And what I'm doing is constantly thinking about the most obvious colour that's missing. So once I've built up a lot of those darker areas on the egg white, I can then think about the most obvious difference between my drawing and the reference photo. And I would say the most obvious here is that the egg white needs more shading. It's not looking anywhere near dark enough. So I could build up a brown and then an orange, just layering these colours one on top of another, still pressing lightly and still building up this pencil in circular motions. I can't stress enough how much of this process is pressing lightly with the pencil. It's not until right at the end that we need to start pressing harder. So now the most obvious thing that's missing to me is that some patches of the egg white are looking nowhere near dark enough, so I can use an extremely dark brown to build up particularly the shadow around the outside as well as some of the dots on the egg. I still think at this point the texture's looking a little bit odd, but that's still okay. It will build up. But I think already it's looking much better on the egg. Now the part that's looking the weirdest is the toast. So kind of the goal at this point is to begin to slightly smooth out that texture. It's all looking a little bit too harsh at this point. So I can work around with the same grey that I used for the base layers to smooth out a lot of that texture and maybe build up a couple of less obvious colours. Like this colour is kind of a earthy yellow, but I can see little hints of this colour in the egg white, so I am going to build it up. And I'm just constantly going through these same few colours, just increasing the contrast, but using the guide of all of the texture that I've built up on the egg. So let's take a minute to focus on the toast now. And before I start building up some colours on top of this texture to smooth it out, I'm actually going to use a darker grey, the darker version of the grey I used to map in these holes to begin with, looking at each hole individually and adding in any shading if some of that hole needs to be a bit darker. So you can see from what I've already added in, I'm not smoothly applying this colour. I'm kind of applying it in the patches that it needs. So if one half of the hole needs to be made darker, I will add this to half of the hole. And just looking through these holes one at a time, This is a much less time consuming process than the initial mapping in, even though it seems like it would be, because at least we have a good idea of what needs to go where. And then once I've built up all of these dots and holes in a bit more detail and it's looking a bit more obvious, I can then start once again looking for the most obvious color at any point that I think is missing over the course of the toast. So for example, I want to focus on making the outline of the toast a little bit darker, particularly the crust, and building up some more of that kind of underlying shading that we added in at the very beginning with the medium French grey, and generally beginning to smooth things out. So you can see in some places I am just shading over the top of all of that texture, and it doesn't make the texture get lost. What it does is makes all of those dots, all of that texture look a little bit less harsh, but it is still there. It's always worth remembering with coloured pencils that when we put one colour over the top of the other, you can generally still see that underlying colour, they just mix together. So to build up texture, we can map in the shapes and then smooth it out, shade over the top, and we can still see that texture. So after adding in some of the details on the egg, adding in some of that pepper, I can keep building up the colours, adding in any colour that I can see that I don't feel I have at the moment. So for example, I'm building up a very light yellow here, and I'm literally just going to keep building colours now over the top of that texture until I feel it matches the reference photo. Now, a little final trick here, if you want to add in any really light areas, some really light details to your texture, is to use something called a jelly roll pen. This is a white gel pen that's amazing at adding some really bright whites in a way that it wouldn't be possible to do with the white coloured pencil. So I can add any of the lightest areas back into the egg white and just smooth out a few final areas. But then we have a lovely, both smooth and textured drawing. So that is how I always build up texture in my coloured pencil drawings, whether it's holy texture like on this toast, or even if it's fair. Start off by building up the base layers, the lightest colours in each area, and generally mapping in all of the underlying shapes before marking in that texture and then smoothing it out. Now, I hope that you found this helpful. Do remember, if you want to go through it in a lot more detail, you can see the full tutorial. If you want to learn more about adding finer details into your coloured pencil drawings, so in this drawing it would be adding the pepper at the end, for example, all of those details that really make it pop, have a look at this video here. Happy drawing, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.